Good afternoon, everybody, and I wanted to welcome you to the second panel session on the topic of paying for the coming wave of ATMPs. I'm Francis Pang, and I'm responsible for global market access at Therapeutics, and will be your moderator for this session. This morning, you heard about the industry perspective when preparing for the development and commercialization of ATMPs. This afternoon, you will not only hear about the payer perspective, but also the patient advocacy perspective, which also did come up in this morning's session. Thank you to ARM for organizing this panel, particularly Paolo Morchesi and Paige Biscoff, who came up with the concept for today's discussion. As Janet Lambert presented this morning, the ATMP field is at a critical inflection point and thriving with a number of therapies in development and moving to regulatory approval and commercialization. As part of getting therapies to patients, ATMP developers will need to undergo the processes of health technology assessment and pricing and reimbursement of ATMPs. This is not a backloaded activity that you think about after regulatory approval, but really requires a number of considerations throughout the value chain of development and commercialization. These may include, for example, establishing earlier dialogue with payers, thinking about value demonstration through evidence generation and real-world evidence, designing innovative payment models, and preparing for joint HTA and cross-border access. And we'll try to cover as many of these during the session today. When designing this session and to frame the discussion, we wanted to come up with a number of practical operational considerations that our members could take away with them when preparing or supporting developers with market access of ATMPs. Commentators often label market access considerations as challenges. I would like to reframe these as opportunities, and we are encouraged by the emerging successful examples of ATMPs actually gaining access and reimbursement. So on that note, I'm truly honored to be joined by an esteemed panel to get their insights and perspectives, who I'll ask to introduce themselves in a moment, as I'm not sure I'll be able to do enough justice to their impressive profiles. I think what goes without saying is that each of these panelists has had a significant impact on access to therapies and people's lives in their work, and continue to do so at this rapidly evolving frontier of medical innovation. So I'll ask the panelists to join me in a second. So in the auditorium, we'll have Yann Lecam. Can you come up, please? And joining us virtually, we have Ulf Maywald from the AOK and Valérie Paris from the HAS. Could I please start the introductions with Yann? And when introducing yourself, could you please give your name, organization, and a flavor of your responsibilities, and I'll come and sit by you.
Good afternoon. I'm Yann Lecam. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and one of the founders of the EURORDIS, the European Organization for Rare Diseases, Rare Disease Europe, which is the equivalent of NORD for the American in the room, and also of the Rare Disease International. So my job is really to bring the patient groups together at the European level to build their capacities and to advocate on rare disease policy, regulatory policy, and also budget priorities at the European level and member states level. And I've been involved into the HTA in France in the board and executive board, and also at the European Medicine Agency in scientific committees and management board.
Thank you very much, Yann. And we have Ulf and Valérie on the line. So Ulf, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I can. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ulf Maywald. I'm a pharmacist by training. Currently, I'm the head of one of the major statutory health insurance companies in Germany, the drug department of that company. So I take care for the billions of euros we spend per year for drugs. And additionally, I'm a former member of the GBA, the Federal Joint Committee in Germany, who maintains the HTA assessment. And so I do have both perspective, let's say a national market access and HTA perspective for Germany, and what makes an ATMP or those new developments with an individual sickness fund, and which hurdles are coming on the later way on, let's say.
And also, I remember you saying that you had over 3 million lives in terms of
Yes,
responsibility.
3.5 million lives we are insuring around the world.
So certainly a major sickness fund in Germany. And we have Valérie also on the line, who's had a very good career actually at the OECD, before joining the HAS. So Valérie, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes,
Thank you.
sure. So I joined the French HTA body, Autorité de Santé, in June 2020. Before that, as you said, I worked at OECD as a policy analyst, and I led a lot of work on pharmaceutical policies. And now at HAS, I'm a member of the board and also the chair of the committee in charge of economic evaluation and public health.
Fantastic. Thank you, Valérie. And also you'll see in your programs a fourth panelist, and sadly she's not able to make it today, Diane Kleinemans, and because of illness, but I'm sure we'll have the benefit of her expertise at a future panel. So I think what we'll try to do is, if possible, try to reflect some of her views actually during the discussion. Yeah. So that'll be testing my memory, I think. But a bit more about myself. I'm Francis Pang from Orchard Therapeutics, which is an ex vivo gene therapy developer. My background is in health economics and market access. So I've had a career in academia and roles on both the payer and industry side. And I've been fortunate to have had first-hand experience of health technology assessment actually in this first wave of ATMPs. And hopefully I'll be able to also share some of the experiences there with you today. So thank you to the panelists actually for your introductions, and let's get started with the discussion. So, right, so it goes without saying that the main objective is for ATMP developers to bring to market products which add value to patients, but also other different stakeholders in the healthcare sort of ecosystem. What are the challenges that you see in recognizing the value proposition of ATMPs, and how does this differ compared with conventional medicines? And what's important from your perspective? And I think I'll start with Valérie on the line. Valérie,
yes, if you allow me, I would like to respond to your questions in two parts. The first is about the terminology value proposition and what it means in the European context. And the second part is about the specificities of advanced therapies, ATMPs. As you know, in Europe, each country has its own process to determine the reimbursement and pricing of the new products coming on the market. The role of HTA, and all countries have implemented HTA in that process, and the role of HTA is first to determine, to give more information about the added value of the new product over existing therapies. And the second part of HTA is to do economic assessment and to assess the opportunity cost of these new therapies. We see more and more consensus, I think, and we expect to see more consensus on the clinical part of this assessment of added benefits, because we have the project of this joint HTA, and we really hope to obtain an agreement of HTA bodies about the clinical added value of new products. For the opportunity cost, by contrast, there are many good reasons for which opportunity costs will differ and still differ across countries. First, the relative costs of resources used in the production of healthcare services is very different from one country to another. And second, you have GDP per capita varying in a ratio from 1 to 5, so very different level of income across countries, and also the share of this national income devoted to health is very different. So it's easy to understand that the willingness, the ability to pay, and the willingness to pay will be quite different from one country to another. But what is so specific about ATMPs in that context? I would say as a first approach that there is no reason to judge the value of ATMP differently than for other products in terms of added clinical benefit and opportunity cost. The questions are for HTA are exactly the same. Does this product add clinical benefit for patients, and how much does it cost for these incremental benefits? The specificities of these therapies is perhaps that the evidence is more often based on small single-arm clinical trials, and that the long-term effects are not completely known at the time of launch, even though we have great expectations about these products. So the economic evaluation is, in that context, is in principle the best way to give justice to these products, because you will be able to demonstrate that the new product brings benefits over a certain period of time, especially when it is very effective, when the benefit is exceptional, or when the savings in the use of healthcare resources in the long term is to be expected. And if you look at the ICER incremental cost effectiveness ratio of some of the advanced therapies estimated in the past, some of them are not really higher than for other therapies. I mean, it's not the opportunity cost of these therapies is not necessarily higher than the opportunity cost of other therapies. So this is there is no how can I say? You can give justice to some of these therapies, especially when they are one-off treatment and curative treatment. So this is a very positive test thing. But the two main challenge for me is first to collect enough data, even after launch and in the real life, to be able to prove and to demonstrate the benefits over the period of time. And the second challenge is to meet countries' expectations in terms of willingness to pay. And this is perhaps the tricky part of the challenge, because many countries do not publish explicit threshold for their willingness to pay. And then they use economic evaluation to inform price negotiations with companies. So I don't know if that helps.
That's absolutely fantastic, Valérie, and certainly you touch upon a number of points, related to the economic analysis of therapies. I mean, I think you're right in terms of health technology assessment as a tool. The basic principles still apply, for ATMPs as compared to conventional therapies. You need to have a comparative analysis. You need to have very clear outcomes. The lifetime horizon is also very, very, very important as well. So, you did talk. You have touched upon durability as one of the key uncertainties, and which is highly relevant for ATMPs, in terms of, how do you actually extrapolate from the treatment effects observed in the study through to a lifetime horizon, and that's something that we'll come back to later. But thank you for your reflections, Valérie, on that. So to Ulf, I'll turn to you. What's important in terms of recognizing the value proposition of ATMPs, and how does this differ compared to conventional medicines from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I have not so much to add on top of Valérie. It was quite conclusive. I think at first I would say it would be an improvement if we get that common European question in future for additional patient-relevant benefit versus standard of care. Yes, Germany and France do ask that question, added benefit versus SOC, quite thoroughly. Not any European country does it, and this might merge a bit in future with European HTA. But I think given the prices or the average prices of ATMPs, this question becomes more and more urgent. Does this ATMP add something on top of the thing we are currently have? And so this question has to be answered. And your question, Francis, is there value in ATMPs? No, there is no inherent value only because a drug is an ATMP. Yeah? The inherent value comes from extraordinary results, one-time results, cure, such things. As payers, we don't really mind whether we pay for a one-time payment or for a chronic payment if we get those patient-relevant effects. We have different let's say hurdles and different challenges in chronic versus one-time, but the underlying question, added benefit versus standard of care, remains the same in both scenarios. And yes, honestly, the systems are currently designed to deal with chronic therapies, and a payer feels a bit uncomfortable to pay for a one-time therapy real money if we get promised effects, at least promised from a certain time period onwards. Yeah? Because we have to pay whatever 10 times the multiplier of the current standard, and we do have 3 years of data. And the question is a bit burning: what happens if the ATMP loses efficacy in year 4? Have we paid 6 years for nothing at the end? And this question has to be addressed. We will discuss it later, not only to be addressed, I think, with some pay for performance models or whatever. It has also to be addressed with evidence, with continuous collecting evidence to get clarity how long such a drug works. And yes, we will have, I think, 2 kinds of ATMPs. ATMPs for one, it's comparably easy to get reimbursed. It's the Orchard drug for MLD, the Zolgensma for a pre-symptomatic kid, where we can avoid even the development of symptoms. This feels fair to pay for, but it will become much more complicated if an ATMP comes with a one-arm study into a space where, let's say, a fair alternative exists. I think on Valrox, they've got their positive opinion shortly, and factor substitution is the standard since whatever 20, 30 years. Now we get a gene therapy with 3 years data. We know quite good what an average factor 8 patient costs, and it's a one-arm study with no obvious additional patient-relevant benefit. And for such drugs, we will have much bigger debates whether it's worth to pay one-off in the beginning an X multiplier of the current standard. Yeah, and so we have, let's say, more solists, the more rare a disease, the more binary the endpoint, the more severe a disease, and the less alternatives. It will be quite easy to get an ATMP marketed and get it reimbursed. And for more common diseases and for diseases with fairly established or good established standard of cares, the hurdle is as the same as for these chronic therapies. Show us on the long run the additional patient-relevant benefit versus current standard of care. That's it.
Yeah. So on the line we have obviously two views about obviously the clinical added value. I mean, you know, for those of you in the audience, I mean, in Germany there is the clinical benefit rating that the AMNOG process comes up with from, you know, it's derived from the data that's been presented to the GBA. And in France you also have an ASMR rating as well, which is the added measure of sort of clinical benefit. And whatever level of rating that a product achieves, it transfers or translates over to the pricing negotiation. But I think from both of your responses, you've spoken about, you know, patient-relevant outcomes, especially in Germany, being really, really important. And we'll talk about actually how to generate those sort of later on, and also the type of comparator as well. So actually, just turning over to Yann, actually, and you know, certainly from a patient advocacy perspective, I know I've known you for over almost 15 years now, and I remember your first initiative was CAVOD, which was clinical added value, right, which is the same principle that Valérie and Ulf were talking about, right?
Yes.
So from your perspective, I mean, what are the challenges that you see in recognizing the value proposition of ATMPs, and how does this differ from conventional medicines? What's important from your perspective?
So I will second obviously most of what Valérie and Ulf said, but with some differences.
Yeah.
From the patient perspective, what counts at the end is, in terms of value, is what's meaningful for patients, what translates into a meaningful benefit.
Yeah.
So just to reposition the discussion about innovation and value, I would say somehow as a provocation that we don't care about the innovation.
Yeah.
What counts for us is how does it translate for patients. The second is the meaningfulness, the utility for the healthcare system, because we care also for that. Now, among the specificity that we see with the ATMPs, with the gene and cell therapies, is the delivery, that the value at the end is if you get the medicine for you or for your relatives. This is what counts. And this is one of the major challenges that we have today with gene and cell therapy in Europe, that there is major differences already for medicines in general, but in particular for gene and cell therapies. Particularly comes in the issues of cross-border healthcare, the fact that sometimes the therapies are going to be delivered in only some centers in one country, and then you have issues of access between regions, or you have it between countries at the European level. The second is the affordability that have been addressed on several occasions, obviously, and the willingness to pay. And that's a major concern for us. So just to be well understood by Ulf and Valérie in particular, but is that you know what our position is in several years, is to say what we want to see in the next 10 years is 3 to 5 times more medicines, but 2 to 3 times cheaper. And we know there is part of a provocation into that, but that's how we see the system working. If we want to have medicines for many more rare diseases, we need to have many more development, many more approval, but we need to see them cheaper. The discussion about opportunity cost has to be the same for rare diseases on advanced therapies than it is for medicines in general. I would disagree with that, politely, but I would disagree. Why? In general principle, yes, I agree. That's where it has to be down the road. But today, where we are, is an absence of therapies. Huge unmet medical needs for most of these rare diseases, particularly the very rare and extra rare. And for them, it is a bit of a social justice to allocate more resources when we have a potential transformative or curative therapies. So it can be beyond the usual attribution of funding for 1 year, for instance, of life survival. And because it is more difficult to assess for rare diseases than it is for cancers or rare cancers even, because you can better measure 3 months gains or 1 year life gain, it's more difficult in rare diseases, then the conversation is more difficult about this difference. The second element is that I would argue that the high innovation currently in the gene and cell therapy deserves to pay more for a certain time if we agree that the policy objective, and make it clear, is down the road, is to reduce that cost for society and for medicines and treatment per patient. But for any new technology coming on the market, there is also always an initial price which is a bit higher. We could take many examples, right, from any digital tools that we use in our hands, like the smartphones initially, or if we use the electric cars and other technologies of this kind. So on the points of evidence, what we see is that it's true for rare disease in general, but even more for gene and cell therapies, is that there is an issue of the, like Valérie said, the set of evidence at the time of marketing authorization. This is, and the rarer the disease, the more the issue is. And this means that there is a high level of uncertainty. So it's good enough, usually at the end of a phase 2 study where there is no other treatments approved, it's good enough in terms of evidence with the clinical trials to go for a positive risk-benefit assessment. But this is based on an artifact, the illusion of an homogeneous population, very small set. The reality of these patients is very different. It's much more heterogeneous. So this level of uncertainty on the data for HTA and for the payers is really an issue, but it's also an issue, I have to say, for the patient and families and for the doctors to prescribe the specialized clinicians. So we think that the sources of evidence have to be looked a bit differently here. Particularly the real-world evidence are important at the time of submission of CHMP, but also for HTA. So that's supposed to collect them early on in parallel to clinical trials on a larger set of patients, but also the patient-reported outcome measures. And that as an additional source of evidence. And my last point on that will be also that in the case of rare disease, and again, often you are working as companies on very rare diseases, and also with the type of technology used in gene and cell therapies, there is another issue, is that with whatever the level of evidence you bring to the committees, these evidences needs to be understood. So that means that there is an issue of knowledge about the rare disease. Very often, these scientific experts or committees are hearing about that disease for the first time when your product is coming. So there is a lack of knowledge about the disease, a lack of knowledge about the technology. Then it's difficult to really assess the set of evidence you're bringing and how meaningful it is. So we need to have a better preparedness on both sides for that.
And I think that's a very useful segue, actually, because we've seen the really rapid technological innovation, over the last sort of couple of years, and actually, how do payers sort of keep up with this? Actually, so can I ask Valérie for some perspectives on that? Actually, how do you actually sort of keep up with the the education and the disease, but also the different types of modalities that are suitable for addressing a disease state? I mean, how do you go about it?
I would like just to say one word about what Yann said just before, if you don't mind, about
Sure.
the opportunity cost and the willingness to pay for rare diseases. Because what I misrepresented perhaps is actually countries may have different ICER thresholds and for different types of disease. And we see now that some countries have higher threshold for severe diseases. And the discussion about rare disease can be open. It's really a health policy perspective, actually. If you want to have more research for orphan drugs, maybe you will have to pay higher prices or having a higher willingness to pay for this type of drugs, advanced therapies or not advanced therapies. By the way, this is true for all rare orphan drugs. So this is really a policy perspective. But I'm sure, and we know that the willingness to pay and the thresholds are not the same for all diseases already. This is the case, and this is also why probably many countries are very reluctant to publish this such a cost-effectiveness threshold, because they want to keep some flexibility, at least for countries which use such threshold, which is not the case of all European countries. So about the knowledge about disease and especially about treatments, maybe this is the time where we could speak about the collection of real-world evidence, because this is a real challenge and something very specific to this type of therapies. And I know that many countries, and at least for France, France requests the collection of data in real life when there is a lack of evidence at the time of launch. And I think the idea for the next years to come is really to work on European registries, especially for rare diseases, so that we collectively know more about these treatments publicly, not only for, between a company and a payer, which was the case so far, or between a company and an HTA body. We would like to have this collection of evidence to be as open as possible.
Great, thank you, Valérie. And I think you've touched upon the importance of real-world evidence generation and long-term data, which can be used for the health technology assessment of ATMPs, but also future reassessments. And thinking about the kind of like the rare diseases kind of perspective, right? I mean, it's unlikely that you're able to get perhaps sufficient patients in a particular country, right? So, what's your view actually on international registries, for data collection, so you actually have a sufficient sort of sample size for statistical inference? What's your view on that?
Are you speaking to Ulf or to myself?
To yourself, Valérie, yes. Yeah.
No, I said this is what we would like. I think we should promote this type of European registries. And this is already done in some cases, I think, but probably Yann know more about this collection of data than I do. But I think this is really something to promote. Yeah. And I think also that the agreement between, what we argued for when I was at OECD, it was not so long ago, is that there should be a continuum between the requirements of AMA, of HTA bodies, and of payers when there are some managed access agreements about the evidence to be collected and to be publicly available to all stakeholders. It would really make sense to have this, the same requests at all levels for evaluation.
Yeah, great, super. So what I'll do is actually sort of switch gears, if I may, actually. So a lot's been discussed about the forthcoming sort of EU regulation on joint HTA, right? It came up this morning. It's going to be a reality on the 12th of January 2025, and it's just around the corner. I mean, if you think about how long the pandemic's actually lasted, years have flown by. So, just to make this a bit more sort of practical and operational, so what would be your sort of suggestions in terms of preparing, how can companies best prepare, and when is the best time to interact with HTA agencies or consortium? So can I ask Ulf about that? Can I ask you first about EU regulation and joint HTA, and actually how would one go about best preparing for that in terms of the sort of the evidence?
Yeah, that's a good question. A crystal ball, how to best prepare. I think it will start slowly, and I think anyone knows we will have been a bit split of assessment and appraisal. Appraisal will remain more or less a national thing for the at least for the early years after 25. Assessment will be a joint assessment, but we will start in oncology, so a lot of ATMPs might not be that early affected, to be honest, and we also do not have, it's my personal opinion, to find a solution to proper deal with ATMPs and one-time therapies. We have not the time to wait until 25. We have to do our homework much earlier. But yes, it's not useless. We also appreciate the European HTA, and I think HAS and GBA are two drivers in that process, and they are engaging themselves. And the most important thing maybe is not the HTA to get proper solutions for ATMPs. It's to address the evidence gaps. And we have discussed on evidence generation, early evidence generation, and maybe we have to cultivate these joint assessments between European HTA bodies and the approval body to get the possibility to, especially in ultra-rare diseases, to register the patients as early as possible, to make a prospective registry from the first patient included in a clinical trial onwards. Because if we do look, for example, SMA is a good example, spinal muscular atrophy. The first patient included in the study for Spinraza was 2013. Now we have 2022. We have 2.5 years of Zolgensma. 11 years later, And we are now establishing our registry in Germany. Well, we have lost 11 years to collect data on the natural history of disease, on the performance of the previous drugs before Zolgensma, and this has to be done at an European level, I think, in future, very early, maybe from granting the orphan designation by EMA onwards, to make sure that we have an infrastructure to collect the evidence we later on need for HTA, regardless if it's a European HTA or if it's a national HTA in the beginning.
Super, Ulf. Thank you for that. So essentially, what you're kind of advocating is that, think about the long-term data collection sort of early, right? And think about whether it should be on a sort of the country or even the pan-national, cross-national sort of level. Absolutely. And you touched upon thinking about the patient-relevant outcomes as well, right? Which is really really important, certainly in the German system. And just to be clear, it's the joint HTA is the joint clinical assessment. It doesn't have the value judgment aspect, right? Which is making the decision based on the economics, right? Side of it. Could I actually ask Valérie again, actually, about her insights in terms of actually how best to prepare, how companies can best prepare, and when is the best time to interact? How about the best time to interact? When would you say is the best time? Obviously, you're going to say the earlier the better, but if you think about perhaps a number of kind of biotech companies or ATMP developers in this space, perhaps they've inherited trials that have been running, for a number of years, and then they take on the development, and so all that opportunity of being able to input into like phase 1 or phase 2 has been missed, right? So what would you say is the best time, best time to interact with HTA agencies, and then what would you recommend?
Yes. So ideally, I think the company should seek to have what we call an early dialogue with HTA bodies and the European agency. It was possible for some drugs in the experiment, the UNETA network, the network which was pre-existing to this new regulation, and there will be a transition phase where some drugs will be also assessed through a joint HTA, a joint assessment, before all drugs or new therapies goes on that road. And there has been an assessment of the practice of early dialogue in the former experiment with UNETA. There was about, I think, a little less than 40 early dialogues, and this is a non-binding scientific advice that companies can seek with HTA bodies and sometimes with EMA to further work on the design of their clinical trials and the type of outcomes that will be recognized to identify added benefits by HTA, European HTA bodies. And I think in many cases it's not too late to add some of this, requested data. For instance, data that will be requested for economic evaluation might be the collection of data about outcomes for patients, about quality of life, for example, and it might not be too late to collect this type of data, which will be requested. And you can, when you have a single arm trial, you can also try to see if you can do comparative analysis with other studies, because in some cases we don't have this comparative clinical trial. But we accept, in terms of clinical or economic assessment, some comparative assessment based on different trials, but there are conditions to do that properly, and probably early dialogue can help to design the studies that will get a favorable assessment by HTA bodies.
Fantastic, Valerie. Certainly, there are opportunities for early dialogue. There are a number of health technology assessment agencies that certainly facilitate that. Certainly, for those developers out there, to take advantage of those opportunities. And I think, as Valerie mentioned, it's not too late, right? If you're kind of quite late into your development program, there are ways of actually generating sort of, data. You could conduct a caregiver survey, that captures patient-reported outcomes, but also impacts actually on the caregivers themselves, right, which can be very useful, when it comes to health technology assessment sort of deliberation. So, so turning to Yann in the room, do you actually have any views on this?
Maybe I will answer you in two parts to build on the answers from Valérie and Haute. First, a very pragmatic one, and the second, more prospective. The pragmatic one is that, as most of you are companies currently at pretty early stage of development, it's not too late, as Valérie said, and for me, it all starts with EMA. Even if it is for HTA after, let me explain. What you can do is to anticipate the development of the registry, which today in Europe is Anchorage. It's disease registry, not product registry. And it is linked to your European funds networks and the disease clinical network within these European funds networks, which are the network of care at the European level specific for rare diseases. The second is your natural history study. The third is your clinical endpoints, already validated or not, your surrogate endpoints, and your patients' reported outcome measures for that disease. You need all of that. And the thing is that for each of these elements, you can have early discussion with the European Medicine Agency. There is departments specialized on registries, on real-world evidence, on natural history. There is people you can talk to. And also there is, at the scientific advice, it's a specific procedure called qualification, scientific qualification. And you want to get your registry, your natural history, your new clinical endpoints, your new surrogate endpoints, and your patient-reported outcome validated by the EMA with scientific qualifications. This will be extremely important. One, for the CHMP, when you have your risk-benefit assessment, but second, for your joint clinical assessment by HTA down the road, because then the evidence you're bringing are at the level and at the quality level expected by regulators from the moment you start your research, to work on the research questions together, but also to see, as we were discussing a moment ago, do you need a registry or do there is one? If there is none, you want to work with the patients on your registry. Natural history study, the same. And again, I go on with clinical endpoints and patients-reported outcome measures. You want to have this discussion early on because patients-reported outcome measures, it takes you about 1 year minimum to work with clinicians and patients to develop them, and then after them to get them qualified and then to collect the data. So it's 4 years, so you need to anticipate.
Yeah, thank you, Yann. And I guess so what you're mentioning is in terms of kind of annotating the clinical measures that you see in trials, like 6-minute walk tests, for example.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean to payers? I mean, it is a predictor of respiratory and cardiac function, but actually to have the patient perspective to describe that has been actually instrumental actually in some of the health technology assessments we've actually seen. But also the patient perspective for filling in sort of evidence gaps as well.
But if I may, Francis, I think what has evolved really, if we compare to a few years ago, the discussion was we need to bring the patients into the room when there is the scientific discussions, because they will provide a patient perspective on what it is to live with Duchenne muscular dystrophy or cerebral leukodystrophy. Today, that's not the conversation anymore. That's there. But what we need is something better, is that in advance, there is a mutual understanding between the company, but with the regulators, the HTA, with the assessors, right? So, and this is where these instruments of patient-reported outcome measures or registries or natural history study are so essential, because then there is an agreement of what are the key questions that we have, what is the instrument to collect the evidence, and then there is trust in the evidence generated.
Yeah. So absolutely having alignment actually in the evidence package, from the perspective of the different sort of stakeholders. And we're very pleased to actually have Valérie and Ulf on the line. So I think what we'll do actually in the remaining time is switch gears and talk about innovative access agreements. So, you may have heard about innovative access agreements, these pay for performance schemes, either as payment by results or payment at results schemes, which sometimes with payments actually phased over time. And just wanted to hear kind of firsthand from a payer in regards to how should companies go about actually designing these innovative access agreements. And can I sort of direct this at Ulf? Ulf, could you give us some insights into that?
I think it's also might be very different across Europe, and depends a bit whether you find a single payer system or a multi-payer system. If you have a really rare disease, and I can only talk in depth for the example of Germany, you have to make your price negotiation at the national level with the Federal Association of Sickness Funds, and this Federal Association of Sick Funds is not willing and not really able to negotiate pay for performance contracts, as they do not have the data to monitor it, and they are reluctant to negotiate something which they cannot monitor. It's a black box for them. And so you have to go to the individual bigger sickness funds with pay for performance contracts. And for that, you need, let's say, a minimum incidence and prevalence. If you have 3 patients across the whole country and 90 sickness funds, no one would invest the work to negotiate a P4P contract if they have only 1 or 2 patients by chance, maybe no patient. And so the more prevalent such an ATMP treated disease is, the easier and the more important is a P4P contract, the more rare a disease is you are done after surviving the national level. And if it comes to individual sickness funds pay for performance contracts, it's very important to be brave and pragmatic, let's say. No one has interest to discuss after closing the contract whether the risk sharing now happens or not, or what are the criteria. The criteria have to be clear, pragmatic, and they have to be trackable out of routinely available claims data. No physician is willing to collect additional data and to get additional bureaucracy on its desk only to make a different price possible between the payer and the pharmaceutical manufacturer. So, for example, if I example spinal muscular atrophy, it could be death as a risk-sharing case. It could be tracheostomia as a proxy for ventilation, whatever. You have to seek proxies in routinely available claims data for the things that happens out there, and showing us what was at the patient, or what's happened at the patient, and do we have share risk or not at that case. So brave, pragmatic, without bureaucracy and without potential for discussion later on. That's the 4 learnings out of a couple of years P4P contracts. It was hard learnings, let's say.
Thank you, Ulf, for those sort of observations. So I think, I guess you're.
And maybe the fifth one sentence less, start also early, because those discussions on P4P, a year is quickly gone. Yeah, so you have also to start prior to launch, for sure.
Yeah, okay. So a number of observations. So start prior to launch when you're designing these innovative access agreements. Think about actually whether it's going to be worthwhile from the insurer's perspective, right, based on a number of patients. Have observable outcomes that don't require additional data collection or administrative burden. So some points there. So I think certainly, we're coming to the end of the hour, and I think I'll attempt to kind of summarize some of the discussion. So in summary, I think the preparation for market access of ATMPs is multifaceted, and I think as we've seen, we're encouraged by emerging successful examples of ATMPs going through the reimbursement processes. It is difficult, but it can be done, right? It's fair to say that some of these processes are still evolving, and we have, a number of initiatives that are coming up, such as the joint HTA in sort of 2025. These processes will evolve to take into account the specific characteristics of ATMPs, but it's really important to be able to prepare for the here and now, right? And as a number of panelists have actually mentioned. For ATMPs, you need to work on a number of things, right? So there's the evidence generation, perhaps the payment models, the pricing simultaneously, as well as think about the opportunities for early dialogue with payers. And we didn't really talk about cross-border access today, but that's certainly another major topic. Currently developers will mostly go through price and reimbursement processes country by country, but there is a possibility of already utilizing joint HTA now, actually, with the FENOSA and Benelux process. And Diane, she would have obviously spoken more about that, and certainly can be approached, if you have an interest in that. There are certain aspects of market access that are particular to ATMPs. A number of ATMPs are inpatient procedures, and that does incur issues as related to diagnosis-related groups, or DRGs. And I think the ARM organization has actually been quite instrumental in actually some policy change regarding that in Germany. Hopefully, the panelists have given you some recommendations on how best to prepare for access. It's a very wide-ranging, sort of complex topic. And you might also be aware that there are ARM working groups that one can join, should you need, further support and assistance. So we have the EU and US Value and Access Committees. I'm sure the organization will be able to arrange for you to join those. And those are really, really useful for preparing for and launching ATMPs. And finally, I would like to thank the outstanding panelists, today, despite some of our technical challenges that we've had. And thank you very much indeed, and have a nice afternoon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.